All right, so in the first chapter of environmental philosophy, From Theory to Practice, we hear a first articulation of what the discipline of environmental philosophy is concerned with according to Sahotra Sarkar. So he starts off the chapter by first demonstrating to us, or first introducing to us, an array of what he considers to be genuine environmental issues. So these range from, for example, the threatened golden-cheeked warbler and the black-capped vireo, which are endangered species that migrate through central Texas, where Sahotra Sarkar is situated and where I did my PhD. He was actually my PhD advisor, so this text is rather near and dear to my heart, which is neither here nor there, but it is relevant to gain a little bit of context. In addition, he talks about some environmental issues that may be prima facie, which in philosophical parlance just means, at a first glance, to be rather controversial in terms of understanding them as environmental ethical problems in particular. For example, he points out that the Sierra Club, an environmentalist organization in the United States, that was founded by an author whom we will read this quarter named John Muir, suffers from some environmental stances that are actually quite racist, insofar as they have, for example, anti-immigration policies built into them, and also insofar as they are ignorant of the fraught history of how America came to be a country with a sort of organized nation-state structure to it in the first place. So over the course of the quarter, we're going to be digging into those more borderline environmental ethical issues in a lot of depth. We're going to be thinking a lot about, for example, environmental feminism, the idea that the historical oppression of women and the degradation of the natural world are actually correlated in a causal way. And we're going to think about environmental racism, the oppression, for example, of very poor individuals who live in what Sarkar calls the global south, or what are typically in the media portrayed as being developing countries. And we're also going to think about the correlation between environmental degradation and the oppression and genocide of Native American or indigenous communities and populations. So we're really going to be shaking things up in terms of what gets qualified as an environmental issue. And at this point in the chapter, Sarkar is just introducing a smattering or a sampling of these questions to us that count as genuinely environmental in nature. So it should be clear to us that these things matter, right? It matters, for example, whether the Bengal tiger goes extinct. It matters whether the Amazon rainforest is cut down solely to provide lumber to industries that really don't need it except in order to make a lot of money or economic gain, right? It matters to us whether our rivers are polluted and whether communities have access to clean water in, say, the Bay Area and globally. All of these issues clearly matter, but why do we want to think about these questions from within the context of philosophy? Why are we not, say, in an ecology class or in an environmental biology class? So in the next section, Sarkar wants to articulate to us why philosophy matters in the context of environmental discourse, conservation, and ethics. So in order to really understand this, we first have to get clear on some terms that Sarkar is assuming we know, but which I'm not going to assume that we know for the purposes of this class. So at this point in the online lecture, I want to demonstrate and introduce a few concepts to you guys that perhaps you've never heard of previously, unless you are, for example, a philosophy major or have taken another philosophy class. So the first set of concepts, please get your notebook out. I'll give you a moment and please pause the video if you don't have that handy. So the first set of concepts that I want to introduce is the distinction between normative descriptions or questions and descriptive descriptions or questions. I know that sounds repetitive, but let me define these terms for you so that we can see what the contrast is between normative analyses and descriptive analyses. So, a normative analysis is etymologically, that means if we break down the components of the word, we see that it means, right, to look at the norms that something prescribes to us, or to think about how we ought to behave, what we ought to do. Whether that's in the context of, for example, ethics. Is it okay for us to kick puppies for fun, or should we not do that? Do we have an ethical duty not to do that? And maybe there are some normative sort of constraints that come up in terms of etiquette, right? It's not polite, for example, to belch at the dinner table. And it's especially impolite to do so if, say, you were to be having dinner with President O'Brien, right? And that wouldn't necessarily be because it's ethically wrong to belch at the table, but because it would be a sort of violation of a constraint on our behavior that is cashed out in a sort of etiquette context. So any sentence that we can propose that has a normative structure is going to tell us something about what we ought to do or what we ought not to do, an obligation that we have, in other words. And that could be an ethical obligation or an obligation of etiquette, professional, etc., etc. A descriptive claim or analysis in philosophy, on the other hand, is not telling us what we should do or what we shouldn't do, right? Those are states of affairs that have not happened yet. They have yet to be. Instead, a descriptive statement tells us about how the world is, right? It purports, at least, to tell us about how the world is. So here's a descriptive statement. A statement is just a sentence that, in the context of philosophy, can be true or false. This is a teapot. That's a sentence that, because we can open our eyes and look at the world and see that the teapot is there, we can verify via our experience that that statement is true. It accurately describes the way that the world is. There is, in fact, a teapot here. We could, however, say something like, the cat is on the couch. There is, much to my sadness, no cat on the couch, so that statement, that descriptive claim, would be false, right? It's not true. Notice that descriptive statements can be true or false in ways that are rather different from the way in which a normative statement can be true or false. So, philosophy is going to operate, and I'm going to assume that we know this distinction throughout the rest of the quarter. It's going to assume that we understand that there are different ways to justify normative claims versus descriptive claims. So, environmental philosophy matters both because of the way that it helps us to describe the way that the world is, and because it can tell us very, very specific things about how we ought to behave within the context of how the world is. So here are some examples of descriptive claims, questions, and lines of inquiry that we're interested in as philosophers and that are important philosophically in order for us to adequately engage in environmental conservation more generally, not just in the classroom, but in practice out in the field. Here's a philosophical question that philosophers, Sarkar claims, are uniquely sort of positioned to answer. What, for example, is biodiversity, right? How do we define what biodiversity is? What is sustainability? You might think that scientists give us answers to those questions, but Oftentimes they don't, right? It's assumed that we kind of understand what biodiversity is when we engage in, for example, wildlife biology, but we don't clearly define our terms. Philosophers are well situated to help out the environmental scientists by doing what some philosophers have called the important conceptual cleaning or bookkeeping work to help us gain clarity with respect to the important concepts that we're using. So this project is called the Project of Conceptual Analysis, looking at the concepts that we use in order to understand their meaning and in order to better understand how we ought to use them, right? So using conceptual analysis to get clear on descriptive claims about the way that the world is, so that perhaps we can use that information in order to get more clear on what we ought to do, right? What our norms are or what they should be. So that's one way in which philosophy helps us. It helps us to clean up our concepts by engaging in important conceptual analysis. Additionally, environmental ethics is concerned primarily with those normative claims that we thought about earlier. When we think about the realm of ethics, we automatically are thinking philosophically. Ethics is a subfield or a sub-branch of philosophy, and ethics takes as its purview the realm of normative analysis, figuring out what we ought to do and what we ought not to do. So though it may seem intuitive to you and I that we ought to, for example, ensure that everyone has access to clean water, or we ought to ensure that tigers don't go extinct, if someone were to ask you why should I care about clean water? Why should I care about indigenous justice? Why should I care about tigers and their conservation? If we don't do the deeper philosophical work in order to justify our claims about what we ought to do, then we're going to be left adrift. We're not going to know how to answer those important questions. So philosophy, by using the tools of argumentative analysis, by getting clear on the reasons that we have that justify what we ought to do, we're better situated to convince people who don't already care about these important considerations to perhaps give it some more thought. And if they're not willing to budge, say from the context of a legal standpoint, then we can use the robust tools of philosophical rationality and reasoning to clearly advocate in favor of those important environmental concerns that are worthy of our care, attention, and advocacy. So philosophy gives us the tools to engage in conceptual analysis, to clearly define our terms, and because philosophy uses argument and rationality or logic in order to give justifications for why we ought to believe something, it can help us to convince those who are not already convinced by drawing on important empirical data in, for example, the environmental sciences to justify ethical claims about that which we ought to do. So philosophy really does play a super important role in terms of what Sarkar refers to important issues of equity and justice. So we're going to think a lot about a variety of those issues throughout this quarter going forward. I'm just going to read us a little bit from the text so that we can sort of attach all of that background thinking that we just did about normativity, description, conceptual analysis, argument, and ethics to the book that we are reading together. So if you want to read along, open up your text to page 6. Why is environmental philosophy important? According to Sarkar, quote, philosophy has two important functions in almost all applied, that means practical, contexts. One, It helps clarify what we do, conceptual analysis, what we perceive as problems, what we set as goals, how we set those goals, and how and why we choose strategies to achieve those goals. For instance, when we argue that a habitat patch should be set aside for nature, are we doing so because of a concern for the species on it, independent of perceived human interests, or because it provides beautiful scenery that we appreciate? When we think about its protection, do we mean we want no human access, less human access, or even restoration of nature at that place? Suppose our focus is on the biota. Does protection mean we want the species to persist, or do we care about the welfare of each individual within the species? Why? When we think of strategy, do we want higher ticket prices, community ownership, state intervention, or some combination of all of these? Why? 2. Philosophy helps to put things in context. Environmental problems may be connected to socio-political problems. For instance, deforestation may be the result of poverty. Moreover, many of the values we cherish, in nature as well as elsewhere, may be in conflict. So at this point in the video, we're going to look at an example, a real-world practical applied case study that Sarkar articulates in box 1.1, which refers to the preservation of wildlife within the context of what has been referred to in the literature as the wildlife wars in East Africa that occurred in the 1980s. So here we start to see how important social justice issues get intertwined with important environmental concerns and conservation. And indeed, the intertwinement of these sets of issues can be extremely complex, right? On the one hand, when we think about the example that's articulated in box 1.1, we see that we want to conserve the black rhinoceros. However, we also see that it's really terrible to militarize individuals in order to shoot poachers on sight, right? Especially when those poachers are members of the global south, have access to fewer economic resources, and tend to be black, right? Furthermore, it seems that the militarization of poachers on the ground in, for example, Tanzania in 1987 and Zimbabwe were funded by, and this is really wild, the World Wildlife Fund, who provided money or funds for guns, ammunitions, and helicopters to help facilitate the patrolling of poachers and their eradication via being shot on sight. So what could philosophy lend to this particular scenario? How can philosophy and the tools of descriptive and normative analysis help us out? Well, here are some deep philosophical questions, right? Is it ever justifiable? Is there ever a permissible norm that states, yeah, sometimes we should prioritize, for example, saving the black rhinoceros over preserving the lives of poachers? Perhaps in some cases, some philosophers, including Roderick Newman, have argued it's permissible to kill poachers if a species is in danger of going extinct. There are other philosophers, however, including, for example, Sarkar and Guha, who we will read later this quarter, who argue that in order to hold those poachers accountable for the eradication of the black rhinoceros, we're essentially overlooking the fact that those individuals are doing that insofar as they are socio-economically oppressed by the global north and have no other means by which to provide for themselves. In other words, some philosophers, including Sarkar and Guha, have traced back this kind of environmental degradation to global capitalism, which is not concerned with the equitable distribution of resources across people. It's not. And colonialism, we'll think about that more as the quarter waxes on, right? So moral philosophers can help us to sort through these issues. Moral philosophers can also help us to figure out whether the black rhinoceros is valuable in itself, intrinsically. We're going to think more about these terms soon, so don't worry if you don't fully grasp them on this first pass. We're going to think about whether the black rhinoceros is valuable in itself or whether it only has value instrumentally, insofar as, for example, it's interesting, beautiful, curious, intriguing to us, right? Or perhaps because it provides us with certain sets of resources. So all of this is just to say, throughout this quarter, we're going to be looking at an array of very complicated, practical, real-world environmental issues, and we're going to use the tools of philosophy to help sort through those issues clearly in a way that will help us to understand whether we should engage in a particular conservation project, how we should engage in it, and why, right? I'm also going to be using this metaphor a lot throughout the quarter, and I use this in all of my classes. But when I say that we have a philosophical toolkit, I mean there are core concepts, distinctions, and methodological tools that we're going to use over and over and over again. Those include the distinction between normative and descriptive analyses, and the idea that philosophical reasoning utilizes the basic tool of argumentation. Going forward, we'll get clear on what a philosophy argument is and what it looks like, but for now, I hope that your interest in this topic is piqued, and I hope that you see that we're up to a lot of extremely interesting stuff over the course of the next 8 weeks. All right, so I'm going to leave you with that today. Go ahead and finish thoroughly finishing Chapter 1. Be sure to upload your introductory videos to Camino if you haven't done so already. This way I can get to know a little bit about you, what interests you, and I can tailor the course accordingly in terms of examples and suggestions and how the course assignments get outlined. So I look forward to seeing you again. Have a fantastic weekend, a beautiful Good Friday if you're celebrating, and I hope that you're taking good care of yourself during these incredibly difficult times. Be patient with yourself, be patient with each other. We can get through this by breathing a little bit more deeply, by being a little bit more accepting of a lack of perfection in ourselves and in each other, and by just knowing that the only constant, as a pre-Socratic ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus says, the only constant that we can be sure of in life and in the universe is change. Things will change. A new day will always dawn, or at least for a few billion years in this solar system. So beautiful to see you in this online way. Have a beautiful day. See you soon.